The courthouse stood tall in the heart of the city, its stone pillars casting long shadows across the crowded steps outside. By early morning, the building already buzzed with activity. Reporters lingered with notepads and cameras, speaking in hushed but hurried voices about the case that had gripped the community for months. Officers in uniform moved steadily through the doors, their expressions set with practiced discipline. Families shuffled nervously, whispering in small groups. It wasn't just another day of hearings. This trial carried weight, the kind that could shift careers, reputations, and perhaps even the course of justice. Inside, the courtroom itself felt both grand and suffocating. High ceilings bore ornate carvings, and tall windows filtered in thin rays of light that cut across polished wooden benches. Rows of people filled the gallery, their voices reduced to murmurs that seemed to dissolve into the heavy air. A bailiff stood firmly by the door, his eyes sweeping the room, reminding everyone of the seriousness of the day. The scent of old paper, polished wood, and faint cologne mixed in the stillness, creating an atmosphere that was both dignified and unsettling. At the center of this gathering, just below the judge's elevated bench, sat something, or rather someone not commonly seen in such a solemn setting. A German shepherd, strong and composed, rested at the side of a police handler. The dog's presence immediately drew whispers. Though trained to remain still, his very existence in the room was unusual. A living piece of evidence representing hours of fieldwork, investigations, and loyalty. He wore a harness embroidered with the word police, gleaming subtly under the lights. His amber eyes swept the courtroom, alert but calm, giving him an air of authority equal to the humans around him. The trial about to begin wasn't ordinary. It involved a high-stakes case where testimony alone wasn't enough. The police dog had been instrumental in uncovering critical evidence, and though he could not speak, his handler was there to describe his actions, his training, and his reliability. For many in the room, the dog was simply another piece of procedure, part of the process. But for others, especially those who noticed how regal and composed he looked, there was something remarkable about his presence, something human-like in the way he sat so proudly. The attorneys at the front shuffled papers, their faces tense and unreadable. The prosecution prepared exhibits, carefully lining up files, photographs, and folders of evidence. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen thoughtfully. Against the table, he glanced once at the German shepherd, eyebrows raising ever so slightly, as if even he acknowledged the animal's unusual role. The hum of anticipation filled the space, the air heavy with the weight of expectation. Then, unnoticed by most at first, the door at the back creaked open again. A young woman slipped in quietly, clutching the small hand of a child. The bailiff gave them a brief look, but seeing the woman's apologetic expression, he let them pass without fuss. It wasn't unusual for people to bring children into courtrooms, though it was discouraged. Still, sometimes life gave little choice. She guided her daughter toward an empty spot at the back, hoping not to disturb anyone. The child, no more than 3 years old, wore a simple pink dress, her small shoes clicking softly against the wooden floor as she walked. Her hair was tied in uneven pigtails, and her eyes, wide and unblinking, darted across the vast room as though she were stepping into another world entirely. Unlike the adults, who seemed weighed down by the seriousness of the place, the little girl radiated unfiltered curiosity. She gripped her mother's hand tightly, but her gaze kept wandering. Few noticed them settle into the bench. A couple of people in the gallery frowned at the disruption, but their attention quickly returned to the front. The mother whispered something to her daughter, smoothing the child's dress and urging her to sit quietly. The girl nodded, swinging her legs absent-mindedly against the seat, her restless energy bubbling beneath the surface. It didn't take long for her gaze to land on the German Shepherd. For the first few moments, she only stared. Her head tilted slightly, her brows furrowed in the way only a child's could when they were both confused and fascinated. She tugged lightly at her mother's sleeve, pointing. The mother glanced toward the front, but dismissed it as nothing more than curiosity. About the dog in uniform. After all, most children would have been interested in seeing such an animal sitting proudly in a courtroom. But for the little girl, this was an ordinary interest. Something about the dog struck her deeply, something that reached beyond the simple wonder of childhood. She sat straighter, no longer swinging her legs, her eyes locked firmly on him. Her lips parted slightly, as though words trembled at the edge of spilling out. Meanwhile, the dog's ears twitched. To everyone else, it was nothing a reflex, perhaps a reaction to the shifting sounds of the courtroom. But to the little girl, it was proof he had noticed her. The connection was immediate, invisible to all except her small, unblinking eyes. The mother, noticing the intensity of her daughter's stare, leaned down again, whispering for her to stay calm. The last thing she wanted was for her child to disturb such a serious proceeding. The girl nodded half-heartedly, but never broke her gaze from the shepherd. The mother sighed, smoothing back her daughter's hair, unaware of the storm brewing. Quietly beneath the surface of her child's innocent expression. At the front, the bailiff called for order as the judge prepared to enter. Everyone rose to their feet, the shuffle of movement echoing across the chamber. Even the German shepherd stood, his posture perfect, his handler giving the faintest tug on the leash. The judge entered with quiet dignity, robes flowing as he ascended to his bench. His gavel struck once, silencing the last of the whispers. "All rise," the bailiff announced. "Court is now in session." The atmosphere thickened instantly. The weight of law pressed down on everyone present. Yet, amid the solemnity, one pair of small, curious eyes continued to study the shepherd. For her, the trial wasn't about legal arguments or justice. It was something much simpler, something purer, recognition. And though no one yet realized it, this ordinary child, tucked quietly in the back row, would soon unravel a truth powerful enough to silence the entire courtroom. The courtroom had returned to silence as the judge settled behind the bench, his gaze sweeping the chamber. Papers rustled faintly, attorneys shifted in their seats, and the bailiff gave a stern nod to the gallery, signaling for everyone to remain. Still, it was the kind of heavy quiet that pressed against people's skin, demanding attention and obedience. But in the back row, one small figure wriggled against the weight of it. The toddler sat beside her mother, her short legs dangling above the polished wooden floor, shoes tapping restlessly against the bench. Her mother whispered a soft warning, pressing a hand against her daughter's knee to still the motion, but it lasted only a moment. The child's energy was boundless, and the stern stillness of the courtroom felt suffocating to her. Her wide eyes wandered again, darting from the judge in his heavy black robe to the jurors shifting uncomfortably in their seats. None of it made sense to her. The words, the rules, the solemnity, it was all an incomprehensible performance. But then her gaze landed, once again, on the German shepherd. He sat tall, chest broad, ears perked in silent alertness. His fur gleamed under the courtroom lights, every line of his body taut with discipline. Most people saw a working dog, a piece of evidence wrapped in muscle and training. But the little girl saw something else. Her small hand gripped the edge of the bench, her eyes locked on him as though she were staring into a memory. "Mama," she whispered urgently, tugging at her mother's sleeve. "That's Buddy." Her mother, weary from juggling work, life, and now the unexpected burden of bringing her daughter into a courtroom, barely glanced down. She offered a quick shake of her head, brushing the words aside. "Sweetheart, sit still. It's not the time," But the girl was insistent. She leaned forward, still staring at the dog. "Mama," she repeated, louder this time. "That's Buddy." The mother stiffened, glancing nervously around at the rows of strangers. A few heads turned at the child's voice, frowns flickering across faces unused to interruptions. Flushing with embarrassment, she placed a firm finger over her daughter's lips. "Quiet," she whispered harshly. "Not now." The little girl pouted, sinking back against the bench, but her eyes didn't waver. She studied the shepherd, the way children study picture books, absorbing every detail with an intensity adults often forget. The tilt of his ears, the brown. Flecks in his fur, the way his tail curled slightly where it rested against the floor. And then, just for a heartbeat, the dog turned his head. His amber eyes scanned the gallery, and for the briefest of moments, they landed on her. It was only a flicker, hardly noticeable to anyone else. But to the girl, it was everything. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart fluttered the way it did when she recognized a familiar lullaby or the smell of cookies baking in the oven. It was recognition pure, unshakable recognition. She sat up straighter. "Buddy," she whispered again, so softly this time that only she could hear. The dog's ears twitched. The mother, meanwhile, rubbed her temples, exhaustion pressing hard against her skull. Bringing her daughter had been a last resort. She had begged a neighbor to watch her, called in favors with friends, but everyone was busy. Missing the trial wasn't an option. She needed to be present, to hear the arguments, to support a relative tied to the case. And so here they were, mother and daughter, squeezed into the back row of a courtroom that had no patience for restless children. She glanced at her daughter again, noticing how unusually still she had become. For a moment, she thought perhaps the quiet discipline of the courtroom had finally sunk in. But then she saw her daughter's unwavering stare and felt unease twist in her stomach. "What is it with you and that dog?" she murmured, too softly for anyone else to hear. The little girl didn't answer. She was lost in her own world, her tiny mind racing with feelings too big for her vocabulary. She remembered warm fur beneath her fingers, the way a wet nose nudged her cheek, the safe comfort of a four-legged guardian who had once been her whole world. She didn't understand words like missing or gone. All she knew was that once she had a dog named Buddy, and he had disappeared. And now, sitting only yards away, she was certain he had returned. At the front of the courtroom, the prosecutor began speaking, outlining the case in careful, measured tones. His voice echoed against the walls, words like evidence, testimony, and reliable witness spilling into the air. Most people leaned forward, straining to catch every detail. The defense scribbled notes, brows furrowed, preparing their counter-arguments. But the toddler heard none of it. Her entire being was focused on the shepherd. She shifted forward on the bench, small hands gripping the polished wood in front of her. Her lips parted again, ready to speak, ready to call out. Her mother noticed the movement and quickly caught her arm. "Don't," she whispered fiercely. Not another word. The child's eyes brimmed with frustration. How could her mother not see? How could no one else notice? It wasn't just any dog, it was her dog. She could feel it in her bones, as clear and undeniable as her own heartbeat. The German shepherd, oblivious to the turmoil in the back row, remained steady at his handler's side. But every so often, his ears flicked, his head tilted almost imperceptibly, as though some part of him sensed a familiar presence. The handler gave the leash a subtle tug, adjusting his posture, completely unaware of the silent thread connecting the animal to a little girl only feet away. In the jury box, a woman shifted uncomfortably, distracted by the faint tapping of small shoes against the bench. The bailiff shot a warning glance toward the back, and the mother flushed again, pulling her daughter closer. But still, the girl's eyes never left the dog. She didn't understand trials. She didn't understand justice or evidence or crime. But she understood love, and she understood familiarity. And in her innocent, unshakable heart, she knew beyond any doubt that the German Shepherd in the courtroom wasn't just a police dog. He was Buddy. And soon, no amount of adult reasoning or courtroom decorum would be able to keep her from proving it. The hum of voices in the courtroom had steadied into a rhythm of procedure. The prosecutor's voice rose and fell in practiced cadence, presenting a clear narrative to the jury. Charts were displayed, photographs laid out, timelines woven into careful threads. The defense watched closely, scribbling notes, leaning back occasionally to exchange whispers. From the judge's bench, a steady gaze tracked every word, his pen tapping lightly against a notepad. To the adults, this was the lifeblood of justice, evidence, and argument battling in quiet precision. To the child in the back row, it was nothing but noise. Her legs swung impatiently from the bench, her small shoes knocking lightly against the wood in a rhythm that made her mother wince. She tried to still them with her hand, but the girl wriggled free. Her attention was locked, unwavering, on the German Shepherd at the front of the courtroom. Every part of him, his stillness, his quiet strength, spoke to her in a language no one else could hear. She tugged her mother's sleeve again, whispering urgently, "Mama, it's Buddy. It's really Buddy." Her mother pressed her lips into a thin line, eyes fixed firmly forward. She'd already warned her daughter twice, already felt the weight of disapproving stares from strangers in the gallery. The courtroom was no place for a child's insistence. Not here, not now. But the girl's persistence only grew. Her little fists clenched at her sides, her chest rising and falling quickly as her determination built. She could feel something inside her, an urgency, a need that couldn't be silenced. And then it happened. Without warning, she stood up. On the bench, her small voice cutting across the prosecutor's steady flow. "Buddy, sit." The words rang sharp and clear, echoing against the polished wood and high ceilings. For a moment, no one reacted. Heads turned in confusion, frowns spreading across faces as they registered the interruption. The mother gasped, reaching to pull her daughter back down, mortified by the sudden outburst. But before she could move, the German Shepherd obeyed. With a fluid, practiced motion, he lowered his body to the ground, his eyes still locked on the child in the back row. His handler blinked in shock, tugging lightly at the leash as though to correct him. The dog ignored it. His tail thumped once against the floor, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat. A ripple of disbelief swept the room. "Did you see that?" Someone whispered. He listened to her. "That's impossible." The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. The gavel struck once, calling for order, but the room remained charged with astonishment. Even the prosecutor faltered, his carefully rehearsed words lost in the air. The defense attorney sat up straighter, pen frozen in his hand, eyebrows arched in disbelief. The toddler smiled, her eyes shining with triumph. She clapped her hands once, a simple gesture of joy, as though nothing could be more natural than her old friend obeying her command. "Good boy, Buddy," she chirped, the mother's face flushed crimson. She scooped her daughter into her arms, whispering furiously, "What are you doing? Sit down this instant." Her voice trembled with embarrassment, with fear of judgment, with a desperate wish to undo what had just unfolded. But it was too late. All eyes were on them now. Or rather, all eyes were on the invisible string that had been pulled taut between the little girl and the dog at the front of the courtroom. The handler tugged again at the leash, whispering a command under his breath. Normally, the shepherd would have responded without hesitation. Today, he didn't move. His amber eyes remained locked on the child, his body poised but relaxed, his ears tilted forward in alertness. It was obedience, yes, but not to his handler. To her. A shiver passed through the gallery. The bailiff stepped forward, ready to restore order, but the judge held up a hand. His sharp eyes studied the scene, the weight of authority heavy in his gaze. He had presided over countless trials, seen tempers flare, watched families break apart in front of him. But never, not once, had he witnessed something like this. The silence that followed was suffocating. Reporters, who had been scribbling furiously moments earlier, froze mid-sentence, their pens hovering above paper. The jurors exchanged uncertain glances, caught between duty and disbelief. Even the attorneys trained to exploit every detail, every crack in the facade, sat momentarily, stunned. The mother clutched her daughter tightly, whispering apologies, her voice breaking with shame. But the little girl only buried her face against her mother's shoulder for a moment, before peeking out again. Her eyes found the shepherd, and she whispered his name once more. Buddy. The dog's ears twitched. His tail gave another slow thump. The handler's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to object, to insist this was nothing more than coincidence, but the words stuck in his throat. Even he couldn't deny what he'd just seen. This wasn't a random act of obedience. This was recognition. The judge's gavel struck again, the sound sharp against the silence. Order, he commanded, though his own voice carried a thread of hesitation. He turned to the handler. Is this dog trained to respond to anyone other than you? The handler shook his head slowly. No, Your Honor. He's trained only to follow my commands. His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed his unease. Yet he obeyed the child, the judge pressed. The handler swallowed. Yes, it appears so. Murmurs swept the courtroom again, louder this time, harder to contain. The bailiff barked a warning for silence, but the energy couldn't be smothered. What had just unfolded wasn't simply unusual, it was extraordinary. In the back row, the mother clutched her daughter tighter, her mind racing. She remembered the flyers she had posted nearly a year ago, the sleepless nights of worry, the unanswered questions. And now, as she watched the shepherd respond to her daughter's voice, a seed of realization began to take root. The little girl's insistence, her unwavering recognition, it wasn't just childish imagination, it was truth. The courtroom had no space for such truths, not yet, but the air had shifted. The weight of the trial, the rigid structure of law, had been pierced by the innocent clarity of a child's voice. And though no one knew it yet, this moment, this simple command, "Buddy, sit," had just changed the course of everything. The courtroom was frozen in a silence, so deep that even the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to grow louder. Every eye, every breath, every heartbeat was drawn toward the unlikely exchange between the toddler and the German shepherd. For a long moment, no one moved. The dog remained seated, exactly as the child had commanded. His handler stood stiffly at his side, the leash clutched in his fist, jaw tight. The little girl leaned forward in her mother's arms, her small face glowing with delight. To her, this wasn't strange or dramatic. This was simple. This was Buddy. But to everyone else in the room, it was unthinkable. A police canine was trained to be unwavering, loyal only to his handler, immune to distractions. Yet here he was, tail thumping lightly against the polished floor, his amber eyes fixed on a 3-year-old girl across the room, as if she were the center of his entire universe. The first sound to break the silence was the rustle of papers as one of the jurors shifted nervously in her seat. Then came the whispering, soft at first, then growing louder, like the spread of a fire that could not be contained. "Did you see that?" He listened to her. "It's not possible." The defense attorney leaned forward, his expression sharp and calculating. The prosecutor frowned deeply, flipping a page of notes he suddenly seemed unable to read. The judge lifted his gavel and struck it hard against the bench. Order! The command echoed through the chamber, but even he could not completely quell the murmurs. They lingered in the air like smoke, stubborn and insistent. The handler cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he began quickly, his voice steady but a shade too high. This is nothing more than coincidence. The dog is trained to follow basic commands. Sit, stay, down. He must have reacted instinctively. But his words rang hollow. The judge raised one eyebrow, leaning slightly forward. Instinctively? To a child he has never met? A child whose voice carries none of your authority? The handler shifted uncomfortably, tugging at the leash. Yes, sir, that must be it. He tugged harder this time, clicking his tongue softly, issuing a quiet command. Heel. Normally, the shepherd would have snapped to attention, rising instantly to his handler's side. Today, he didn't move. His ears flicked, his gaze never wavered from the girl. He stayed where he was, as if the leash tethering him meant nothing at all. Gasps spread again through the gallery. The mother clutched her daughter tightly, heat rising in her cheeks. Embarrassment clashed with something else, something sharper, heavier, twisting deep in her chest. She shook her head, whispering desperately to her child, "Stop it. Do you hear me? Stop it right now." But the little girl wriggled against her grasp, her small voice bubbling with laughter. "Mama, Buddy knows me. Look, he's happy." Her words sliced through the courtroom like another command. As if on cue, the shepherd's tail began to sweep across the floor in slow, deliberate strokes. His ears perked higher, and a faint whine escaped his throat, soft, mournful, familiar. The handler paled. "No," he muttered under his breath, tugging harder. "No, no, no." The judge's eyes narrowed further. He leaned back in his chair, silent, as though weighing a truth too impossible to speak aloud. His fingers tapped, once against the polished wood of his bench. In the gallery, the whispers turned to low voices, emotions spilling over. Some were confused, others were moved. More than a few were shaken. It wasn't just the obedience anymore, it was the recognition. The dog wasn't reacting to a random child. He was responding to someone he knew. The mother's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind raced back to the nights of searching, the posters taped to lampposts, the desperate pleas for information. Nearly a year had passed since their family dog had vanished without a trace. They had mourned, grieved, moved forward as best they could. But now, staring at the shepherd whose eyes mirrored the same warmth she remembered, she felt the impossible tugging at her soul. Could it be? She shook her head violently, willing the thought away. "No," she whispered to herself. "It can't be. It's not him. It's just a dog." But deep down, she wasn't convinced. The toddler, however, had no such doubts. Her innocence shielded her from reason, from logic, from the thousand explanations adults cling to. All she knew was truth, pure and unfiltered. She reached one small hand toward the front of the courtroom, fingers stretching as though she could bridge the distance between them. "Buddy," she whispered again, her voice trembling with joy. The German shepherd's body shifted. His ears tilted forward, his weight leaning subtly against the leash, his amber eyes softening. A low whine escaped him once more, louder this time, reverberating through the quiet. The handler froze. He had trained with this dog for months, guided him through drills, missions, and discipline. Never, not once, had he seen him break focus. But now, in front of a crowded courtroom, he was watching the unthinkable. The K-9 wasn't responding to his commands. He was responding to hers. The bailiff stepped forward again, glancing at the judge, awaiting direction. For a moment, even the judge looked uncertain, caught between enforcing order and acknowledging what was unfolding before his eyes. Finally, he cleared his throat, his voice low but steady. "We will recess 10 minutes." The gavel struck once more, and the command rippled through the courtroom. But even as people rose from their seats, collecting their belongings, their eyes lingered on the shepherd and the little girl who had pierced the silence. The mother buried her face in her hands, torn between mortification and dawning realization. The child nestled closer into her arms, but her eyes never left the dog. She whispered softly, as though sharing a secret with him alone. "I found you, buddy. I found you." And though no one spoke it aloud, everyone in that room felt it. Something extraordinary had just been set in motion, and there would be no turning back. The moment the toddler's words pierced the courtroom air, Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her. At first, she thought her daughter was merely being playful children, often blurted out strange things at the most inconvenient moments. But when she saw the German shepherd respond instantly, tail wagging, ears perked, Sarah's blood ran cold. That was not coincidence. That was recognition. Her breath caught in her throat as memories flooded back. Almost a year ago, she and her little girl had lost their beloved dog, Buddy. He had been more than a pet. He was family. One stormy night, he had slipped through a broken gate, disappearing into the darkness. They had searched for weeks, plastering flyers, walking the neighborhood, calling shelters, even driving out to rural roads in desperation. But Buddy was gone. Now, standing in the center of a courtroom, her child had just called him by name, and he had answered. The judge banged the gavel, trying to restore order. Gasps and murmurs had erupted among the spectators, and even the attorneys exchanged bewildered glances. But Sarah barely noticed them. Her eyes were locked on the dog. His fur looked the same, that deep chestnut and sable coat with a white streak. On his paw the same streak, Sarah used to joke, was his sock. His eyes, those warm amber eyes, were unmistakable. The handler tugged at the dog's lead, urging him to stay seated, but Buddy's tail was thumping against the wooden floor with frantic joy. Sarah's daughter tugged on her arm again. "Mommy, it's Buddy. He found us," she said, her little voice full of excitement and innocence. Unaware of the storm her words had unleashed, tears blurred Sarah's vision. She tried to compose herself, but her hands trembled as she brought them to her mouth. How could this be? How could the dog they had grieved, the dog she had sworn she'd never stop looking for, be sitting here in court as an officer's canine? The odds seemed impossible, yet the proof was staring her in the face. The judge ordered a recess. The courtroom emptied slowly, buzzing with speculation. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered about fate and miracles. Sarah gathered her daughter into her lap, hugging her tightly, but her eyes never left the dog. Buddy, her buddy, was still watching them, his body tense with the desire to run across the room, but held back by duty. The handler, Officer Martinez, finally approached Sarah. His face was a mixture of confusion and discomfort. "Ma'am," he said cautiously, "this is Canine Rex. He's a trained service dog. I'm not sure what your daughter thinks she saw." But Sarah cut him off, her voice trembling but firm. "No, that's not Rex. That's Buddy. He was ours. He has the scar under his left ear from when he cut himself on the fence. He always tilts his head when he hears the piano. He—" Her words faltered as her throat tightened with emotion. "You can't tell me that's not him." The officer shifted uncomfortably. He came to the department through a shelter program. He had no listed owner. Sarah's heart twisted. The shelter. She had called every shelter in the county. How had they missed him? Or had he been picked up later, after she had stopped calling every single day? The guilt hit her like a wave. If she had searched harder, longer, maybe Buddy wouldn't have been drafted into a life he wasn't meant for. Her daughter wriggled free from her arms and toddled over toward the dog. The bailiff tried to block her, but the judge, still watching, in fascination, held up a hand to let her through. The little girl crouched in front of the German shepherd, her eyes wide and shining. "Hi, Buddy," she whispered. "It's me." The courtroom went still. The handler gave a gentle tug on the leash, but Buddy ignored it. Slowly, he lowered his head until it touched the little girl's knee. His body trembled with a soft whine, the unmistakable sound of recognition. Tears rolled down Sarah's cheeks. She covered her mouth, trying not to sob out loud. The judge leaned forward, his expression softened by the undeniable bond unfolding before him. "Officer Martinez," he said quietly, "that doesn't look like a coincidence to me." Sarah's mind raced as she pieced together the timeline. Buddy had vanished in late spring. The shelter program that partnered with law enforcement had begun intake that summer. The puzzle pieces fit almost too neatly. She remembered the way Buddy had always been protective of her daughter, how he had stood between her and strangers, how he had curled up beside her bed at night. That same dog was now wearing a vest and badge, serving strangers in a courtroom. Yet his heart had never forgotten his family. She felt a pang of conflicting emotions. Pride swelled that her dog had become something so noble, saving lives and upholding justice. But the ache of loss gnawed at her. She had never wanted him to serve strangers. He was supposed to grow up alongside her daughter, to be her playmate, her protector, her constant companion. And now, fate had thrown them all together again, in the most unlikely place. The recess stretched on, with lawyers huddled and whispered debates, the judge conferring with clerks, and officers stealing curious glances. Sarah sat frozen, her daughter's small hand clutching hers tightly. Buddy never stopped watching them. He responded to commands from his handler, but every so often, his gaze drifted back to Sarah and her child, as if making sure they were still there. For Sarah, each glance was a knife and a balm at once. He remembered. She knew it. Yet he was bound by a duty that wasn't his to choose. When proceedings resumed, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. But Sarah's heart was no longer on the trial. Her world had narrowed down to one impossible question. What would happen to Buddy now? Would the system let her reclaim him? Or would he remain trapped in a role that tore him from the family he loved? Her shock had not faded, it had only deepened. What began as a simple day of accompanying her daughter to court had turned into a life-altering moment. She had walked in carrying grief and acceptance of a loss she thought permanent. Now she sat with her heart pounding, caught between hope and despair, watching her little girl whisper to the dog who had once slept at the foot of her bed. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of law and order. It felt like a stage for fate itself. And Sarah, trembling with disbelief and longing, realized she was witnessing not just a reunion, but a battle for the future of their family. The gavel struck wood once more, but its echo was weak, almost hesitant, as if even the judge himself could not command the room's attention. All eyes were still fixed on the German shepherd, on Buddy, or Rex, depending on which truth one chose to believe. Judge Hamilton leaned back in his high-backed chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. A man of 62, with nearly 4 decades in the law, he had seen his share of courtroom surprises confessions mid-trial, witnesses breaking down under pressure, even a defendant collapsing to his knees in repentance. But this was something else entirely. This was not law. This was not evidence. This was something deeper, primal, human. It was a bond. He cleared his throat, though his voice betrayed a rare tremor. Order must be maintained, he said. Yet no one in the courtroom stirred. The silence clung to the air like a weight. Even the court stenographer had paused, her fingers hovering above the keys, transfixed. The little girl still knelt beside. The dog, her tiny hands brushing his fur with the innocent reverence only a child could give. The German shepherd pressed closer, tail sweeping against the floor, eyes soft with recognition. The judge's gaze lingered on the pair. He had owned a dog once years ago, a loyal Labrador named Max. The memory stirred something in him now. Unbidden, he remembered how Max would wait by the window every evening, sensing his return before his car even turned onto the street. Dogs, he knew, carried a loyalty that defied logic. Could the law ever account for such loyalty? But as judge, Hamilton was not allowed the luxury of sentiment. His duty was to justice, to structure, to the rules of society. And the law was clear. Property, once transferred through legal channels, could not simply be reclaimed by emotional. Peel. The canine program treated its dogs as officers, bound to service. To remove one was to disrupt not only a unit, but potentially a community's safety. Yet what was he to do with the sight before him? He shifted his eyes to Officer Martinez, who still stood awkwardly by, his hand on the leash, but his control tenuous at best. The officer's brow furrowed with uncertainty. "Your Honor," Martinez finally said, "this is highly irregular. The dog was assigned to me as K9 Rex. He's been trained, certified, and bonded with the department. He's not his." Words trailed off as the shepherd let out a low whine, refusing to move from the child's side. "He's not acting like he usually does," he admitted at last. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Some faces were softened by tears, others tense with skepticism. A lawyer from the defense rose. "Your Honor, with respect, this matter is irrelevant to the trial at hand. We cannot let an outburst from a child derail proceedings." But, before he could finish, the girl spoke again. Clear as a bell, her voice carried across the courtroom. "Buddy, sing." The shepherd lifted his head, ears twitching, and let out a long, low howl, the same song Sarah remembered from the nights her daughter would play piano at home. Gasps filled the room. The defense lawyer sat down, silenced by what felt like undeniable proof. The judge's heart clenched. This was no trick, no accident of training. This was recognition. And in that recognition lay a question of law that had no precedent. Who did the dog belong to, the system that had given him a badge, or the family? He had never forgotten. Hamilton rubbed at his temples. He thought of the statutes, the property codes, the contractual agreements that bound Canine South to their handlers. Yet, as he looked at the child hugging the dog's neck, he asked himself a question he had not entertained in years. What does justice look like when law alone cannot capture truth? He glanced toward Sarah. The mother's face was pale, streaked with tears, but her eyes were steady, unwavering. She was ready to fight. He could see it in her posture, in the way she clutched her daughter's hand. She would not let this go quietly. The bailiff approached, whispering, "Shall I separate them, Your Honor?" Hamilton hesitated, his hand hovering above the gavel. To separate them felt cruel, almost inhumane. Yet he had a responsibility. The courtroom was not a place for reunions, no matter how miraculous. It was a place for order, for judgment. "No," the judge said finally, his voice quieter than before. "Not yet." The bailiff stepped back. The gallery leaned forward, sensing the gravity of the moment. Hamilton turned his eyes toward the jury box, though the jurors themselves looked as bewildered as anyone. They had not signed up for this. They had come expecting evidence, testimony, and law. Instead, they were witnessing what felt like destiny unfolding in real time. For the first time in years, Hamilton considered recess not as a procedural tool, but as an escape. He wanted to step outside, to breathe, to clear his head from the collision of law and heart that clouded his judgment. But he remained seated, locked in his chair, because he knew everyone was looking to him. "Officer Martinez," he said at last, his tone heavy, "I must ask you something difficult. Has the dog ever responded in this manner to anyone else before?" Martinez swallowed hard. "No, Your Honor. Rex Buddy, he's disciplined, trained to focus. I've never seen him break protocol like this. Not once." That admission was damning, and the room knew it. The dog's behavior spoke louder than any human testimony could. The dilemma pressed tighter against the judge's chest. If he honored the law strictly, Buddy would remain property of the department, another cog in the machinery of justice. But if he honored what he had witnessed, what everyone had witnessed, he would be admitting that the law had no place in matters of the heart. For a long moment, Hamilton closed his eyes. He thought of his own children, now grown. He thought of Max, his old Labrador, who had died in his arms years ago. He thought of the times he had chosen the law over empathy, believing it was the only way to remain fair. But today, fairness felt like something larger, something deeper. When he opened his eyes, they glistened faintly. The courtroom waited, breathless. "This court," he began slowly, "is bound by the statutes of law, and yet," he paused, voice catching slightly, "it is also bound by the pursuit of justice. Sometimes the two are not the same." A murmur swept through the crowd. The judge raised a hand for silence. His gaze settled once more on the child, who had curled into the shepherd's side, her small fingers buried in his fur. "This is not a decision I can make lightly," Hamilton continued. "I cannot, in good conscience, disregard what has unfolded here today. But nor can I ignore the obligations that bind this dog to service." He turned to Officer Martinez. "Until further notice, this dog will not be removed from this courtroom or separated from the child. I will convene with both legal counsel and the department to determine the next course of action. In the meantime, this court stands in recess." The gavel fell not with the authority of command, but with the weight of a man torn between law and love. As the courtroom erupted in whispers and speculation, Sarah clutched her daughter, heart pounding. For the first time since Buddy's disappearance, she felt a spark of hope. The judge had not dismissed her claim. He had not denied the bond. He had left the door open, however narrowly, for the impossible to become real. But she also knew the battle was only beginning. The system would not yield easily. The dog was more than property. He was an officer. And officers did not simply go home because a child whispered their name. Still, as Buddy nuzzled her daughter's cheek, Sarah let herself believe, just for a moment, that love might stand a chance against the law. The courtroom had never felt so heavy with silence. The kind of silence that pressed on every chest, making breaths shallow and hearts race. Moments ago, it had been filled with the steady rhythm of legal arguments, the sharp scratching of pens on notepads, and the judge's deliberate, commanding voice. But now all of that seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the sound of one child's voice echoing in memory. "Buddy, sit!" The words replayed in everyone's minds, as if stitched into the very air of the room. No one had expected. The police dog trained rigorously, obedient only to its handler, to respond so instantly to a toddler's command. Yet there the German shepherd had been, dropping into a perfect sit, his eyes softening in recognition of a voice from a past he clearly had not forgotten. The judge, an experienced man who had seen hardened criminals break down in tears and victims rise with bravery, sat frozen in his chair. His gavel rested unused by his hand, because no ruling, no strike of wood on wood, could possibly contain what had just unfolded. He studied the child, her small hand clutching the air where the dog once stood, her innocent face glowing with the kind of purity the courtroom rarely witnessed. Across the aisle, the bailiff shifted uneasily, torn between duty and awe. The handler stood stiff as a statue, his jaw tight, his pride wounded. For him, the dog was not just a partner, but an extension of his own body and authority. To see the shepherd obey someone else, especially a toddler, was nothing short of humiliating. And yet, as much as he wanted to deny it, the truth sat plainly before them all. The mother trembled in her seat, torn between fear and wonder. She had come to court only to fulfill a civic duty, never expecting the day to become the unraveling of a mystery that had haunted her family for months. Buddy, her daughter's beloved pet, lost one stormy night, was sitting in the courtroom, clad now in the harness of a service animal, but unmistakably the same creature who had once lain beside her child's crib, guarding her through the night. The judge finally exhaled, the sound breaking the stillness like glass shattering. "This court will take a momentary recess," he said, his voice gravelly, almost uncertain. But before his gavel could strike, the toddler did something no one had anticipated. She stood on her tiny legs, wobbly but determined, and called out again, her voice clearer, steadier. "Buddy, come!" Gasps rippled across the benches. The handler whispered a firm command under his breath, trying to override her words. But the shepherd's ears perked, and in that instant, duty bowed to love. With deliberate steps, the dog broke formation, padding across the courtroom floor, his nails clicking against the polished wood. He ignored the handler's tense orders. He ignored the eyes that watched with disbelief. All that mattered was the little girl. When Buddy reached her, the child threw her arms around his neck, burying her face into his fur. The dog leaned into her embrace, his body trembling with a kind of release, a joy no amount of training could suppress. The sound that came from him was not the sharp bark of a working canine, but the soft, rumbling whine of recognition, of coming home. The courtroom was no longer silent. It was filled with something deeper, an invisible swell of emotion. The stenographer, usually stone-faced, dabbed at her eyes. Jurors looked at one another, unsure if they had just witnessed evidence or a miracle. The judge removed his glasses, his eyes glistening as he set them aside. And even the bailiff, usually, unmoved by the dramas of the court, shifted uncomfortably, fighting the lump in his throat. The handler's voice broke through, harsh and commanding. "Return!" But the dog didn't budge. His loyalty had been redirected, and no stern word could sever the bond of memory rekindled in that child's voice. The handler's face flushed red as murmurs rose from the gallery, questioning the truth about the animal's past, questioning the system that had overlooked a family's loss in exchange for another's gain. The judge rapped his gavel once, but it was not with anger, it was with resignation. "Order," he said softly, though no one dared to move. His eyes, however, were not on the attorneys, nor on the handler. They were on the child, still clinging to the shepherd as though afraid he would vanish again. In that moment, the trial itself seemed to fade into irrelevance. The facts, the testimonies, the legal documents, none of it could compete with the truth standing right there. A dog who had been loved, lost, and found again in the most unlikely of places. The mother spoke, her voice quivering but strong enough to carry across the courtroom. "Your Honor, that dog, he belongs to us. My daughter has not slept a full night since he disappeared. He isn't just a pet, he's family." The handler began to protest, citing contracts, protocols, and ownership rights. But his words felt hollow against the weight of what everyone had just seen with their own eyes. The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "There are laws, yes, but there is also justice. And justice is not blind to truth when it stares us in the face." His voice trembled, but there was a conviction behind it that silenced even the most skeptical onlookers. The toddler lifted her head, her cheeks flushed, her eyes shining. She looked around the room with a kind of innocence that disarmed even the sternest hearts. Then, in her small, unwavering voice, she said, "Buddy's home now." Those words, simple yet profound, seemed to etch themselves into the walls of the courthouse. It wasn't just a child's declaration. It was a verdict of its own, one no jury could overrule. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was not heavy with shock, but with awe. No one moved, no one spoke, because everyone present knew they had just witnessed something rare, a moment of truth that no gavel could contain, a moment where law and love stood side by side, and love had won. The air in the courtroom was still charged with what had just unfolded. The toddler's words, "Buddy's home now," hung like an unshuckable truth, reverberating through every corner of the chamber. For a moment, no one dared to move. The attorneys, who moments earlier had been sharpening arguments like weapons, now sat quietly, their legal pads useless against the undeniable evidence of love and recognition that had just silenced them all. Buddy lay at the child's feet now, his large frame curled protectively around her tiny shoes. His breathing was steady, his eyes half closed in contentment, but anyone watching could see his ears twitch every time she shifted, every time she breathed. He was alert, not to threats, not to commands, but to her presence. It was as though his world had finally realigned after being broken apart. The mother sat close, one hand pressed to her lips, the other gripping the edge of the wooden bench. Tears spilled freely, now tears of relief, of disbelief, of fear that this reunion might still be snatched away by the cold mechanics of law. The handler stood stiffly, his fists clenched. His pride had been shattered in front of the court. A dog that once obeyed him without hesitation had disobeyed at the sound of a child's voice. For him, it was not just about a dog. It was about authority, about the certainty of his role. He wanted to argue, to demand, to remind everyone of regulations and procedures. But even he could not deny the undeniable. The shepherd was no ordinary police dog. He was a lost family member, stolen not by malice perhaps, but by circumstance, and yet fate had brought him back. The judge leaned forward, his hands folded together, his eyes no longer those of a detached adjudicator, but of a man witnessing something sacred. He cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. "This courtroom deals in truth," he said softly, "but rarely does truth arrive in such pure form. Today it has." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some nodded. Others wiped at their eyes. Even the court reporter, whose duty was to remain impartial, found her hands trembling as she typed. The toddler looked up at the judge, her eyes wide and innocent, not fully understanding the weight of her words or the storm she had calmed. To her, Buddy was not evidence, not a subject of legal debate. He was simply her dog, her friend, her guardian who had finally returned. The judge sighed deeply, his voice carrying a kind of reverence as he continued. By the letter of the law, this animal is a working dog, assigned and trained for duty. But by the spirit of justice, what we have seen today is clear. He is, and always has been, part of this child's family. The handler spoke at last, his voice strained. "Your Honor, the department." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "The department will have to answer for how this situation came to be. But as for today, this court cannot and will not deny the truth. Justice is not blind to the heart." Gasps and whispers filled the room. The mother pressed her hands together. In gratitude, her body trembling as though years of grief and longing were finally loosening their grip. The toddler knelt down again, stroking Buddy's ears, whispering something no one else could hear. The dog wagged his tail softly, his entire being focused only on her. The judge's gavel struck not as a weapon of finality, but as a symbol of peace. It is the ruling of this court that custody of this animal be returned to the rightful family. Case dismissed. The sound of that gavel was followed by an eruption, not of chaos, but of applause. The gallery, unable to contain itself, broke into claps and cheers. Some cried openly, others simply shook their heads in awe at the miracle they had just witnessed. The bailiff, usually the stern enforcer of order, allowed it to continue, recognizing that some moments demanded celebration rather than silence. The handler lowered his head, his shoulders heavy. Whatever pride he had lost was replaced by something else, a dawning recognition that perhaps in this case, love had done what no training manual ever could. He turned to leave, and though bitterness lingered, there was also respect in the way he glanced once more at the child and the shepherd. The mother knelt down beside her daughter, her arms wrapping around both child and dog. Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of joy now. "He's home," she whispered, as though saying it aloud would make it real, solid, unshakable. The little girl nodded, her face buried in Buddy's fur. "Buddy found me," she whispered back. And in that moment, it didn't matter that they were in a courtroom, under the gaze of law. What mattered was the reunion of souls that belonged together. As people slowly began to leave, the story was already spreading. Jurors would tell their families. Reporters in the back, who had scribbled furiously during the scene, would write headlines that captured only fragments of the miracle. But those who were there knew the truth. They had witnessed a rare collision of justice and humanity, of law and love. The judge remained seated long after the room had emptied, staring at the spot where the child and dog had embraced. He thought about all the cases he had presided over, all the times he had ruled with logic, with evidence, with reason. But today, a 3-year-old girl had reminded him that sometimes justice was not found in statutes or arguments, but in the simplest truths spoken with a child's voice. Outside the courthouse, the air felt fresher, freer. The little girl clutched Buddy's leash, though anyone watching could tell it was Buddy who guided her. The mother walked beside them, her steps lighter than they had been in months. Onlookers paused as they passed, some smiling, some wiping their eyes, because even strangers could sense the story unfolding before them. The child stopped on the courthouse steps, turning to Buddy. She placed her tiny hand on his nose and whispered, "No more leaving, okay?" Buddy gave a small bark, almost as if answering. The crowd laughed softly, their hearts warmed by the innocence of it. For the family, it was the beginning of healing. For the court, it was a reminder that justice was not only about punishment and rules, but about truth and compassion. And for everyone who witnessed it, the memory of that day would remain a story passed down, told and retold, about the little girl who spoke 2 words that silenced a courtroom and set love free. Because sometimes justice doesn't wear a robe or hold a gavel. Sometimes justice is a child's voice calling out to her lost dog, and the dog answering with all the loyalty in his heart. And so the story ended not with the echo of law, but with the softer, stronger sound of love finding its way home.